And Ed.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm going to talk in two directions. First of all, try and take a few of the points that Christian raises in his book and throw up some of the, perhaps the issues that they throw up for how we deal with these sorts of challenges in less developed countries and in some cases post-conflict countries. But then also to reflect upon some of the lessons of the work that we're doing on examining public financial management reforms in some post-conflict states and see if that throws some examples, some real-life examples of that. First thing just to note is, of course, that public sector reform is big business in many of the developing countries in which we work, and thus public sector innovation is also quite a big issue. Not because necessarily governments in those countries are attempting to innovate, but because they are either the recipients of a lot of exported practice, which is innovative, sense, or a lot of experimentation perhaps with new models. And so I think this is a real challenge for them, if not something they're consciously pursuing. The two perspectives that I think Christian mentioned are quite interesting. What's the relevance for the public sector themselves in those countries, and what are the lessons for international engagements in these sorts of processes? Evidence from, for example, the World Bank independent evaluation of public sector reform efforts 2 or 3 years ago shows a rather mixed picture, and particularly on the administrative and civil service reform work, not much progress has been made on that. So I think there's certainly some lessons to be learned. I wanted to pick 4 reflections on why this might resonate, the points coming out of particularly of Christian's book. First of all, the tension between the role of bureaucracy and the push for innovation. In Christian's book, he mentions, references one of the purposes of the Wilson take on bureaucracy being as promote stability and to deal with uncertainty. On the other hand, what we're trying to talk about is change, and some of the approaches we particularly apply have rather traditional methods and models of public sector administration, which are trying to root in sort of formality and those sorts of disciplines. And if we're looking more creatively at change management processes, is there a tension between those two issues? Secondly is around the issue of risk tolerance, risk management, and how we deal with risk. This is perhaps a particular reflection on international agencies and that sort of engagement. At the moment, this sort of combination of spending cuts and the concern on how well money is spent on international development efforts, together with a rather long run and sustained and quite appropriate concern on leakages and misuse of funds, doesn't necessarily inspire a culture of innovative practice of risk-taking. And that may pose some problems for thinking about some of the application. Added to that, the sort of standard operating procedures almost that you mentioned in public sector organisations, in donors. And this seemed to play out in terms of the evidence quite strongly in a recent paper by Ignatios, USAID, reflecting on the lack of a culture of innovation and risk-taking and the sort of compliance and counter-bureaucracy culture in USAID and the World Bank. One issue on risk which I think you point the way, which is quite interesting and perhaps offers a view here, is the role of philanthropic organisation and funds, which maybe are capable of dealing with experimentation, innovation, and different sort of risk profile of the way in which they intervene. And perhaps there's an opportunity for a synergy there between those sorts of organisations and the role they play in some of these points. The role of citizens and citizen expectations as a driver of improved public services is clearly a very strong message that comes through from this thinking in this book. I note quite strongly that you're not necessarily advocating a strong effort on sort of volunteerism and the engagement in that sense, but at least a perception and understanding of what expectations are around service delivery and that being used to channel that. I think that gives us pause for thought in terms of the countries and the context that we're talking about developmentally. First of all, what do those expectations look like? The OECD framework that you pull out in your book has 4 components to it. Public value, which I know is a sort of concept much discussed in OECD, is associated with productivity, service experience, results, and democracy. And clearly that holds in the countries that you're talking about in the book. Interesting to see, if you change those assumptions, or ask those assumptions are reasonable, would you keep the same sort of practices, the same sort of approaches? What might that change? And so in terms of the approach to sort of co-creation, participation was the word that seemed to spring to mind quite a lot as where has this message apparently been learned and applied in the sort of countries we work. But what's our experience of participation? It's participatory poverty assessments, PRSPs, sector-wide approaches. These don't necessarily have a strong track record of the sorts of participation that you're talking about. And we maybe need to think about the way in which those co-creation, co-design processes work in those sorts of countries to understand that better. Fourth point that resonated for me was around lessons in understanding service delivery. You talk about the concept of service journeys, I think, in your book, and understanding what's the chain from a policy announcement through to frontline service delivery and engagement with a customer or client or service group there. And the experience that we have from some of the work, looking at the way modalities work, for example, shows that perhaps is not well enough understood. This is partly a political question. One example that springs to mind for some work I was involved is the Uganda education sector, where a central policy around universal primary education, improving the education system there, has not, the way that's been implemented has actually cut out, in some ways, the role of local government, the role in terms of its superintendents, its issues, but it's given much more power in some ways to frontline service providers, but changed the incentives. It's also changed the funding arrangement so that local governments are no longer responsible for raising the revenues and therefore no longer feel so responsible for the services they provide. That dynamic has caused not only a technocratic inattention because of the underfunding of that middle tier, but perhaps also a political inattention because they feel they can pass the buck up the chain to people who are less engaged with that service delivery process. So understanding that and the political dimension of that seemed maybe a valuable tool together with the delivery chain analysis, which I know is an aspect in the UK we've been talking about. In terms of the work we've been doing on looking across post-conflict states, 3 or 4 reflections emerged there, which I'll cover quite quickly, mindful of time. The preface is that perhaps there's a greater innovation potential in these sorts of contexts than in some of the non-post-conflict developing countries in which we work. Perhaps there is less existing by way of the public sector infrastructure or a greater appetite to design from scratch, which creates some opportunity. But I would certainly also echo Paul's point about attending to the basics as well. Looking across 8 countries, 3 of which were in Africa in the form of Liberia, Sierra Leone and DRC, and therefore a Democratic Republic of Congo for Christian's benefit, are not necessarily, and therefore are covered in this. Capacity is obviously of critical importance. It's also one of the big legs on your stool of getting innovation right, and I think the largest section of your book almost is dedicated to capacity. Incentives and motivation can't be taken for granted in any sense, and these are issues around public sector pay and the relationships there, the use of external consultants versus strengthening staff and civil service positions. So there's some simple things that need to be done, and but that also perhaps applies opportunities to the change management process. The second area is this question of innovation. Innovation risks being associated in the public finance field with medium-term expenditure frameworks, financial management information systems, results-based management practices. And even in some of these raw post-conflict environments, we see a lot of evidence of that. Introducing results-based management in Democratic Republic of Congo, not necessarily a clever idea, yet it was attempted. One of the earliest attempts, reforms in Sierra Leone after the conflict, was a policy-based, multi-year forecast budget process. Again, not a particularly sensible innovation. Clearly innovative, but we need to see the advantages and the appropriateness of those sorts of innovation. It also caused me to think that innovation is, in all those senses, innovation by external agents on the country, rather than some sort of self-generated sense of innovation and what might work with the institutional environment and the political environment that works there. That might be a more useful entry point. And we talked a little bit about the service delivery impulse. This assumes, in the OECD context, citizens striving for world-class service delivery. That may not well be the requirement in many of the countries that we're talking about. The very relationship between the state and citizens, differently cast in terms of patron-client relationships and the clientelism, and in post-conflict situations, allocating resources through the budget process to appease warring factions. So if there isn't such a strong demand for service delivery, because it's not the rawest priority, are there other mechanisms that we can channel in? A couple of points might come from discussion, but I'll pause there in the interest of time for discussion.